Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you may be joining us today. Thank you for attending today's presentation, Evolving Drug Testing Policies, Your Must-Know Strategies for 2025. While this session is hosted by CISIV, a global leader in background screening and compliance-driven human capital and risk management solutions, we're delighted to have attendees from across our family of brands. Whether you registered through PreCheck, Driver IQ, or one of our other divisions, thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is presented by the Drug Screening Compliance Institute, experts in employment, drug and alcohol screening policies, laws, and regulations. This session has been pre-approved by both SHRM and HRCI for 1 hour of continuing education credit. The presentation is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slides, will be emailed to all registered participants in the coming days. Before we get started, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items. Due to the high volume of attendees, everyone would be muted to ensure the best experience. If you have any issues during the presentation, you can interact with us using the chat pane in Zoom. If you have any questions for our presenters, you may enter them in the Q&A tab, and we will try to address them at the end of the presentation. Thanks again for joining us today. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers, Bill Judge and Nick Hartman from the Drug Screening Compliance Institute. Bill and Nick, please take it away.
Thanks, Antique. Thanks to CISIV for hosting today's conversation and for everybody joining us from the CISIV family. As mentioned, my name is Nick Hartman, managing partner here at the Drug Screening Compliance Institute. Joining me is my colleague, Bill Judge, our lead research attorney. While Bill is an attorney, we're going to try really hard not to hold that against him in today's conversation. But I want to make sure that we get the legal disclaimer out there that we are not a law firm. Today's information is for general informational purposes only. As you can imagine, everyone's employment situation and workplace situation is different. So we strongly encourage you to leverage subject matter experts, lawyers, etc., prior to taking any action based on today's information. Pretty aggressive agenda today. We're going to start with some updates, some recent updates that happened over the year. We're going to talk about some numbers that quantify the problem that employers are dealing with today with substance use. We're going to focus the core of our conversation today on the new legal limitations that employers are having to deal with, specifically the legal term off-duty use, what that means, both from a legal and practical perspective, and share with you guys some evolving drug testing strategies that you can start working on now and plan for in the coming year. And of course, we'll leave you with some screening program guidance. So starting with some legal updates, some fresh, hot off the press stuff that's evolved over this last year. I think that everybody is well aware that we just went through an election, good old November. A lot of action leading up to the election, specifically as it relates to marijuana laws, lobbying on both sides, whether they should be passed for both medical and legal use of marijuana. As it stands right now, I think everything's wrapped and official that Nebraska voters there approved 2 different medical marijuana initiatives. However, even prior to voting day, there was a pending legal challenge to kind of similar bill to what happened in South Dakota, where 2 ballot initiatives were on there. Whether the legality of the language was correct is being challenged right now. So we're waiting as of right now to see how that legal challenge pans out. We may even have an answer by this time next week. But as it stands, looking at the legal language in Nebraska, there were no specific employer limitations as the bill was drafted. But we do caution everybody, as you will learn in our conversation as it progresses today, that those that use medical marijuana lawfully under state law may find employer protections under state human rights laws, which we will definitely divulge into that detail greater.
Right.
We also had a hotly contested legal marijuana ballot in Florida that was just shy. It fell just shy of the 60% majority that it needed. So that was rejected, as well as initiatives in both North Dakota and South Dakota, all states that look to legalize the legal adult use of marijuana. And Bill, you said that they're probably all going to be back on in starting next year, likely as well, right?
The organizations behind those initiatives are already have begun to fundraise and promise to be back.
We also have some activity that DSCI is tracking as we keep abreast of all these changes and follow different initiatives and bills that are floating around until they come to life or die in committee. But we know that lawmakers in both Hawaii and Wisconsin are working on adult use of marijuana legalization bills. So we'll keep track of all that as well. Probably the only two federal items that we're going to talk about today, because our conversation is going to be really state law focused. But at the federal level, of course, we've heard of the potential rescheduling of cannabis at the federal level, potentially as being recommended right now, removing it from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 substance. Of course, there is also activity lobbying to remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act entirely. Of course, with the election happening there, with the DEA and FDA making recommendations, I think that all got punted till early next year. So we're all going to have to wait and see how that pans
Yeah.
out. Bill, I don't know if you have
It's
any
a,
comment.
it's a complicated and very interesting political dilemma that's going on right now. There was even I was reading this morning, there's an effort underway to remove DEA from the hearing that they scheduled. It's a bizarre sort of situation.
Yeah, and what the impacts are, of course, will vary depending on how it's rescheduled. So that'll be a topic for another conversation.
Yeah.
Just on Monday, some big splashes came in the trucking world. For those that are familiar with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Clearinghouse, Clearinghouse 2 rolled out on Monday. And essentially, in short term, what happened was that the FMCSA database is now integrated with state law Department of Motor Vehicle databases. So if a driver is in a prohibited status in the clearinghouse, that integration's now talking to state DMVs and actually revoking commercial's driver license for those individuals. It was a kind of a loophole when a clearinghouse originally rolled out, and they're obviously enhancing that now. So I think this last stat was like 178, so nearly 200,000 drivers or those that had a CDL are currently in a prohibited status and now have revoked CDL.
Yeah, in a situation where there are a limited number of drivers to begin with, that's going to have an impact.
Sure does. So again, hopefully that incentivizes those individuals to go through the treatment and return to duty process and get back online. But again, for those that not are aware, that happened as of Monday.
Right.
All right. So again, that's probably all the stuff we're going to be talking about at a federal level. Everything now will be essentially state focused, but we like to share with you every time we get in front of you some stats that paint the picture of substance use in our nation's workforces. And we still can see some concerns in the latest data. Again, this is sourced from our friends at Quest Diagnostics. Every year they provide industry related data based on all the drug tests that they process each year in their drug testing index. And Bill, I always get the numbers wrong, but we do about how many drug tests in our workplaces each year?
We can confirm, and this has bounced around. This number has bounced around from time to time, but we can confirm that there are anywhere from 45 to 50 million drug tests done in our nation's workplaces every year. That's a lot, 45 to 50 million. And when you look at that first statistic there that Quest tells us we're at a 20-year high of 4.6% positivity rate, multiply that by the 45 to 50 million that are being tested every year. That's a lot of people who are testing positive. Now, what happens to them in terms of whether they're terminated or suspended or what the disciplinary action is, that's up to employers, but that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people that are being caught using illicit substances in our nation's workforces, which is most concerning, right? I think we collectively could say that we really don't care what someone does on their free time, but bringing that brain or that influence into the workplace causes a myriad of issues and safety concerns. So obviously, we're going to pick on marijuana a little bit because it's driving a lot of these numbers, but the positivity rate for marijuana in the general workforce, we saw a 45% increase over the last 5 years. That's 2019 to 2023. And an alarming stat that I think every employer should be aware of is that marijuana positives found in post-accident drug tests increased 114% from 2015 to 2023. And Bill, you want to elaborate as to why?
Why that number is important and why post-accident it's important to point out is because not only had we been talking about it and written about it, but Quest agreed with our position, which is that this reflects the fact that more and more employers are dropping marijuana from their pre-employment testing. Even if you drop it, it's going to show up someplace because of the increased number of adults using marijuana in this country. It's reflected here in the 114% increase in the post-accident rates, but that's something to keep in mind. Now, I don't think we have a slide on it specifically, but I'll just tell you that there are only a handful of laws, jurisdictions that prohibit marijuana testing. The rest prohibit discrimination if you get a marijuana positive. That means that if somebody's in a safety sensitive job, you can still take employment action against them because they can't probably meet the job description or the job responsibilities safely. So there's a big difference between prohibiting testing and prohibiting discrimination. Keep that point in mind as we go through this.
That's a great point, Bill. We talk to employers every single day, and they're battling a labor industry issues, and they're battling whether or not the fairness for testing for cannabis. So they're talking about, or at least looking into the idea of removing cannabis from pre-hire drug tests. Right here, you see the cause and effect, right? Just because you don't screen for it pre-hire doesn't mean that problem's going away.
That's right.
And hopefully we can give you guys some strategies and some confidence to continue screening for cannabis pre-hire, again, in those jurisdictions. Now, elaborating a little bit more, as it's no surprise as you legalize adult use of marijuana, the positivity rates have increased 118%. In states that authorize the medical use of cannabis, we see the positivity rate increasing almost 70%, and that's stats from 2012 to 2020. Bill loves this stat. In states that have no legalized marijuana use, which are now fewer and far between, however, the positive rate still increased by about 60%, and it went up another 6.5% in the latest Quest DTI data.
Yeah,
So again,
it's no major surprise here. I mean, people aren't stupid. You've got border states that legalize the use of marijuana. People are going to come across the line there in Nebraska to Colorado or Iowa to Illinois, and they're going to buy some marijuana.
It happens, you're right. We saw that alcohol and marijuana sales skyrocketed during the pandemic. We really feel like employees that were self-medicating during those times maybe still be in those habits right now or battling those habits. And we're not just picking on marijuana in this conversation. We saw in the latest Quest DTI data some increases in amphetamine use and cocaine positives. So again, it's not just cannabis. One of the big things I wanted to highlight on this slide, Bill, was for the very first time, Quest provided us some insight onto drug test cheating, how many tests were adulterated, substituted, or whatever the case might be, someone coming into the collection site trying to beat the test. And their data showed that a 633% increase in someone trying to cheat a urine drug test over last year. That's pretty alarming.
If you've got a 118% increase in the positivity rate in those states that legalize marijuana and nearly 70% increase in those with medical use of marijuana, it's no surprise that people are going to try and find a way around the test. I had a relative who came to me in July of this year who said that they were about to start a job in September in the medical field, and they knew they were going to be subject to testing. They wanted to know how they could avoid testing positive. My answer was quite simple: stop
using drugs. That'd be good. But it's going to segue nicely into our conversations. As we talk to how the drug testing world is evolving for workplace drug testing and what different methodologies are available that might prove to be a little bit more helpful in conducting your workplace drug testing. But first, Bill, we'll get real legalese here and talk about the new legal limitations that that employers are facing as a result of these marijuana laws, specifically about a legal term that we're going to divulge in from both the legal and practical perspective, which is off-duty use and what the heck that means, right?
That entails a whole bunch of things. So we're going to get into.
That's right. So again, as it stands today, here's the clear picture. We have 38 and maybe 39 if we get to fill in Nebraska here. Washington, D.C., obviously a few U.S. territories that authorize the medical use of cannabis from various different reasons, anywhere from chronic pain to debilitating conditions like cancer, epilepsy, etc. There are 24 states in Washington, D.C., and a few U.S. territories that authorize the adult use of marijuana for those 21 years or older. We have 18 states that authorize some form of medical cannabidiol or CBD or low THC oils for various medical reasons. And as you can see, the state pictures are starting to all fill in here. What we really want to harp on is that there really are no two states where the laws are the same. The laws vary dramatically as to who qualifies, what prohibitions or limitations might be as far as workplace testing, both testing and also on taking action based on a positive drug test.
And there may be some commonalities between the states, but there's significant differences that you've got to take into consideration. And I would also mention about the cannabidiol or CBD. Our map here reflects those states that have specifically enacted laws that allow the use of CBD for medical reasons. That doesn't take into consideration the hemp-derived CBD, where most of the states that have authorized the growth and the sale of CBD products are not reflected on this map at all.
That's the stuff you can get at your local drugstores or the smoke shops or gas stations, or of course, what Bill calls the World Wide Web. You can get that stuff pretty readily, right?
Great caution must be taken, however. Yeah.
Yeah. And really, the big trend that we're tracking with these laws is that states are passing these laws or amending their marijuana laws to more so now include employee protections for those that lawfully use cannabis or cannabis products under state law. Obviously, these things are going to greatly impact the who, what, when, where, why, and how you can test for the drug, and also what disciplines can be imposed for both job applicants and employees. And Bill, just really quickly, I know we talked about there's a legal term there called lawful activities or lawful product laws that were really decades old from back in like the smoking era for cigarettes, right?
Oh,
And now we're
absolutely.
starting to see some bleed over with legal cannabis.
As I recall, there are 19 states that have specific rules that prohibit employer action against anyone who's lawfully using a lawful product off duty. Now, how one defines a lawful product may vary state by state. We have such a law here in Illinois, and a court recently upheld an employer's policy that essentially overlooked that whole section of the statute. There's a Supreme Court of Colorado decision, the Coates decision, that in the last few years came out and essentially said that although marijuana use may be lawful under Colorado law, it is not lawful under federal law, therefore it's not lawful. So you've got to be very careful to make sure that you're not only taking into account the state statutes, regulations, but also court decisions on this issue before you take action.
Yep. And again, that's all we do all day long is take a look at all that stuff and try to make some sense of it. But when you talk about off duty, that has a very legal term to it. And you'll start to see as our conversation goes through here that lawmakers are trying to discern off duty through lawmaking, which is silly, but it's what us as employers and subject matter experts have to deal with, right? So there are states that will and municipalities that are limiting or prohibiting testing for cannabis as a condition of employment. We have examples in California, Nevada, New York, New Jersey, some municipalities like Philadelphia, where I'm sitting here in Washington State. There are limitations on how you can test for cannabis pre-hire. We're going to talk about some of those details. New York State has a law that prohibits testing for cannabis outside of reasonable suspicion. Are you providing your managers and supervisors with training on how to recognize the signs and symptoms of substance use? If not, you should be. Now, that differs from the New York City, within the city limits of New York City, where they prohibit marijuana testing, of course, with a safety sensitive carve out there.
That's right. They have their own ordinance there, and as well as Philadelphia. And now, as of a couple of weeks ago, Pittsburgh. So you got to take those things into account as well.
I was just gonna say that our friends in PA are doing it by municipality. But I guess more concerning for us is that there are 8 states that limit or prohibit employer action or discrimination against lawful marijuana use outside the workplace. So the law specifically says outside the workplace. And there are dozens of other states that we searched that have very similar limitations that are implied because they use the term at work or off duty, right?
Very interesting. Not only do you have those states that have specific language that say you can't take action for off-duty use, you've got to also look at how the language is written in those states that do authorize use. There are 28 states that basically limit employer action to situations where someone is believed to have used or is under the influence at work. Okay, is that protecting the off-duty use? It's a whole debate that hasn't even begun yet in the courts.
And we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail as well. But a quick word of caution for regarding medical marijuana. Again, this is different than the adult use laws, but there's certainly a trend that we're tracking in the courts where medical marijuana patients are actually finding protections while they may not explicitly have protections in the state medical marijuana law from adverse employment actions. They're finding help under state disability discrimination laws or human rights laws that protect their underlying medical condition for which they are authorized to use medical cannabis. And I don't know, Bill, if you want to touch on the Barbudo case really quick.
There's, for instance, the state Supreme Court in Massachusetts in the Barbudo decision essentially ruled that the employee who was fired for testing positive and claimed to be protected under the state's medical marijuana law, the state Supreme Court said, no, you aren't protected because the state legislature didn't give you the right to sue. So there's no private right of action is what it's called. And the legislature in Massachusetts didn't give you that. However, you may have a cause of action under our state's disability discrimination law. So it's almost like getting free help from the state Supreme Judicial Court there.
Yeah, the big thing here is not to blindly discriminate against someone's as their status as a medical marijuana patient or just because of the fact that they are authorized to use it. And there may be limitations on medical marijuana patients that test positive during a workplace drug test. There may be limitations there by state. So again, it's critical to understand the rules, regulations, and case law in all the states and even at the municipal level where you're conducting business. And we're going to give you a few examples real quick here.
Yeah, exactly. So here, pre-employment in these 6 states, as well as New York City, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, you cannot conduct pre-employment cannabis testing, except there are some safety carve-outs to take into consideration.
That's right.
Here in California and Washington, the state statutes, some of them recently starting this year, like California, prohibit employer action if the drug test reveals, quote, non-psychoactive marijuana metabolites. What does that mean? It boils down to you're going to have a test that reveals delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinoid or delta-9. Unless you have a test that shows delta-9, you can't take action. And one thing to keep in mind is if you're doing urine testing in those states, you're not going to be able to take action because you cannot show delta-9 from a urine test. Yeah. I don't know how to get more emphatic about it. We get calls about this all the time. Can we continue doing urine testing in California and Washington? The answer is yes, but if you want to take action, the answer is no. Now
you're dropping a lot of truth bombs there, Bill, and we got this is a lot of change that are happening for employers, so we got to divulge in that a little bit, right? As you mentioned, California has the law on the books limiting drug tests that must reveal non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. There's a law where I'm sitting right now in Washington State that applies very similarly. Now, the Washington State law is specific to pre-employment testing. California's law applies to all reasons for tests.
Correct.
We also see some similarities in the laws in like Connecticut, where they exempt cases of reasonable suspicion post-accident and approve random programs, but otherwise they must show delta-9 as well. And really what's happening here is we've had 40 plus years of workplace drug testing using urine, and we're identifying the metabolite of cannabis. Now lawmakers are creating laws that are prohibiting us from taking adverse action just solely based on a cannabis metabolite. There's some science we're going to talk about here in a minute to paint that picture a little bit better, but
let me also mention there are a couple other states with some peculiarities that are along those lines, and Arizona and New Mexico. You can't take action unless the marijuana result shows nanogram levels. That's what it's measured in, nanograms, but it's got to show nanogram levels that show or are at the level of intoxication. What is that?
Yeah, exactly. And that's still a question that's unknown, right? I really quickly want to, I know we shared this last time we had the conversation, but I want to touch on California and Washington's law to paint
Yeah.
the picture because we see this now being a trend that will carry over in other states more than likely, right?
We found the legislative findings in the bill 2188 rather interesting because first of all, they said that THC, tetrahydrocannabinoid, is the chemical compound that can indicate impairment and cause psychoactive effects. There are several others. You have to understand that in the cannabis plant, there's been over 500 different compounds identified. Okay, so we're talking just about the ones that are psychoactive. There's not only THC, but there's something called hydroxy THC, which is also psychoactive. Unfortunately, what our testing system has been based on since the late 1980s using urine is something called carboxy THC, which is a non-psychoactive component of cannabis. In fact, courts in Idaho have even said if you find a carboxy THC result, it's considered a negative.
Yeah.
In Michigan, they don't even consider it a controlled substance. And yet that's what we're testing for.
But it's an important point, Bill, because this is the first time that I can remember that state legislators are creating laws that are now creating that determination that Delta 9 it creates impairment. There's some science that's slowly catching up from that, but from a legal perspective, this was very impactful.
Absolutely.
So it changes the world for California employers that it specifically says that you cannot take adverse action on an employer-required drug test where you've or identified non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites in their hair, their blood, their urine, or other bodily fluids. And it talks about using scientifically valid pre-employment drug screenings. I think there was a law they even elaborated here that the employers had ample access to ways to determine if someone's use was on duty or off duty, which was completely false at that time, right?
Exactly right.
There is
Now,
a safety sensitive exception, obviously, in California. This is specific to those individuals that are in the building and construction trades. Of course, the state of California did not define that, and they are elaborating their law, I think, to now include first responders or those that use a weapon for their job. That's still up to debate. But the big thing here is the law, while Bill mentioned this earlier, it doesn't specifically prohibit or limit you from testing for cannabis, but it absolutely does prohibit discrimination based on a positive test result that includes non-impairing cannabis metabolites.
exactly. And I'll mention one more thing about California, and then we can move on, is there was a bill passed shortly after AB 2188, and that is SB 700, which limits employers' ability to ask about an applicant's past use of marijuana.
It's a good point too, because that's really not a focus of workplace drug testing, but asking about it pre-hire is definitely a no in California and other states as well. Flipping to Washington State, where I'm at now, a very similar law went into effect this year. Again, prohibiting employers for taking adverse action based on a drug test result that had non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. Now, again, I mentioned this law is specific to pre-employment drug testing only, doesn't apply to any post-hire drug testing. But again, you're going to need to use a methodology that identifies Delta 9 specifically before denying someone a job in Washington State that tested positive. State of Washington, they did a little bit of a favor better than California by having a far more, or I would say a slightly more robust safety sensitive carve out that of course includes different industries, first responders, of course the airline industry got in there, but letter G was a general safety sensitive carve out for any safety sensitive positions for which impairment while working presents a substantial risk of death.
Now,
And of course it how do you prove that's going to be through your job descriptions, hopefully? But obviously, it went on to say such safety sensitive positions must be identified by the employer, job descriptions, to the applicant before the application for employment. So saying that in your job posting, you must say this is a safety sensitive position and why. So again, see this evolution changing a little bit with the way that the laws are changing. That obviously means you as an employer are going to have to evolve your workplace drug testing strategy. And again, we'll take the risk to elaborate that Bill is a lawyer, but we'll do a quick little science lesson here on how cannabis breaks down once it's consumed.
It's absolutely becoming critical, not just in the states we've highlighted so far, but in others. But it's important to understand how marijuana breaks down in the body, how it works, so that you can actually prepare your programs accordingly. When someone uses marijuana, what happens is it breaks down in the body to the principal psychoactive metabolite of delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinoid. The problem is that only stays in the body about up to 1 to 8 hours. It's gone. It's not detectable typically by our use of urine testing, for instance, and certainly not hair testing. Delta 9 breaks down in the body further to what's known as hydroxy THC. That too stays in the body only a short period of time, 3 to 12 hours. That breaks down then further into what's known as carboxy THC, which can stay in the body days, even weeks, depending on how much one uses and how big you are, and because it attaches to body fats. Okay, so when you're considering compliance with states' laws like in California and Washington and even Arizona, New Mexico, Connecticut, you've got to consider what test methodology you're going to use. So we've used urine as the standard for years and years. Does that apply then here in these states? No, because you can't find delta 9 using urine testing. So if you want to take action on a marijuana positive, you're going to have to use something that detects it, that detects delta 9, and that's oral fluid. It's the only thing that can test or is oral fluid. Actually, you can find it in breath as well, in blood, but those things are gone by the wayside or whatever. You don't want to stick needles in people. So oral fluid is probably going to be your answer.
And that certainly is the trend that we're seeing, and we're gonna dive into that here in a moment as well. But you're absolutely right, Bill. When drug testing first started, we were simply looking for the presence of past substance use, right? Because it's easy.
Because it was illegal.
Obviously, carboxy THC, it's fat soluble, it sticks around. You can find it. It's easy to find. You also mentioned the detection time periods. Most drugs of abuse have a very short shelf life, 1 to 3 days from last use. Obviously, cannabis being the outlier there because it can stick around to your body fat far longer, up to, like you said, 90 days, sometimes weeks, months, whatever the case might be. With today's testing, of course, and now with lawmakers creating laws that limit our ability to test for the carboxy THC or the non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites, that certainly changes the script on testing strategies. You mentioned we're recommending oral fluid. Blood is also an option, but it's incredibly invasive and expensive, but it can be found there as well.
Right.
I want to make it very clear that, again, there's plenty of scientific studies and individuals that are far smarter than us trying to tackle this problem. But as it stands right now, carboxy THC as metabolite does not indicate impairment. There is no methodology, there's no device, there's no per se limit that exists to determine whether someone is impaired or under the influence right now of marijuana. So really the legal threshold that we're going to help you try to reach here is using that legal threshold that lawmakers are using, which is use while at work or determining recent use of cannabis.
Yeah, that's the key. Your policies, your procedures should be focused on trying to identify use.
Yeah.
Getting into the whole impairment issue is it's too preliminary.
We're probably decades off, Bill, from determining if someone's impaired via marijuana. Like I said, the science is incredibly more difficult than that of something like breath alcohol or alcohol testing. And I just wanted to show just a quick little visual here. You see the different detection time periods for THC, for carboxy mainly in this data. But hair obviously gives you the longer lifestyle type test. Urine has a detection time window far more after use, but obviously could last several days. Blood gets you a little bit tighter. Saliva or oral fluid, which we're talking about now, it shows about a 3 to 4 hour window, but it's actually, there's some outfits out there that are shortening that time window. Our friends at Buzzkill Labs out of California are working on a device that can narrow a oral fluid test using chromatography technology that shortens that window to about 5 to 8 hours or so. So it's depending on the
actually their data shows that with their use of chromatography, they're able to identify 3.5 to 4 hours use.
And I guess it depends on what cutoff level you're using there, but it's incredibly fascinating technology. We heard a lot about breath for drugs of abuse testing. I think that's fizzled out now because it's incredibly difficult and you have to use picograms per milliliter for testing for breath. So whether there's volatility there or not is still, again, up to the smart scientific people out there.
Yeah, by the way, I would just suggest if you're curious about this, study that last slide. That in terms of determining what test methodologies to use, understand this slide. If you understand this slide, it should be a relatively simple thing for you to choose the test methodology to use.
It's a good point. If
And
you're
if
looking
need be,
for
just
a
give us a
pre-hire
call.
drug test, you want to see some historical use in jurisdictions and states that allow you to use a test for carboxy, then of course that would be more appropriate. But if you're talking about something more of a recent event, post-hire, reasonable suspicion, post-accident type drug test, you're going to want a drug test that shows you a little bit shorter detection time
That's
period.
right.
So again, getting into some more strategies, things to consider right now and into as you adjust your workplace screening programs in 2025, please don't just be this guy here and put your head in the sand and ignore the issue. Don't just remove cannabis testing because it's complicated or difficult. Even if you're scared that potentially you may be limited by state law or case law for testing, right now it's very far and few between those states and jurisdictions that prohibit testing. It's more like we had said
Right.
earlier, it's more on the actions you take based on a positive. Pre-employment drug testing is still permissible, very few exceptions there. Make sure you're reviewing the different screening methods out there. Oral fluid drug testing, we're going to talk about that. We're going to elaborate a little bit more on that, but we think it's a fascinating concept and truly the tool that's going to get you there for detecting more recent use. But there may be instances where you still want to utilize urine or hair drug testing. There's also a gigantic difference between rapid and instant drug tests versus lab-based testing. The cutoff levels are significantly different, and we can elaborate that there are some instant devices out there that have 10 times the detection time limit or a cutoff level being used than that of lab-based testing. So you may be missing positive drug tests by using a less sensitive instant testing device. And again, I mentioned this earlier, for medical marijuana, do not blindly refuse to hire someone who claims they're a medical marijuana user. There is an opportunity there. And when we're talking about state human rights laws for employers, they should be prepared to engage in an interactive conversation in those instances to determine if someone can be reasonably accommodated or not for the job prior to refusing to hire or taking any adverse employment action, and an incredibly critical action step prior to taking action.
And those of you operating in New York State, please be careful because a medical marijuana patient is by law considered to be protected as a handicapped person. So be careful.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point, Bill. Some laws are very, I would say, less or more employer friendly. Some are less employer friendly. The state of New York, as you said, they consider anyone who's authorized to use medical cannabis in that state to be disabled, thus then automatically afforded state human rights protections. And I think that trend is also continuing through
Yeah.
other states.
Even Nevada, the law specifically says you don't have to, as an employer, accommodate the use of marijuana at work, but you must consider and accommodate the underlying medical condition
Yeah.
of a medical marijuana patient. So it can be very confusing.
So from a post-employment testing perspective, as far as strategy is concerned, I don't know how else to say it, but you must have a robust post-hire testing process, especially in those states and cities that prohibit testing for marijuana pre-hire. We talked about reasonable suspicion testing, post-accident testing, random testing, are all critical components. And please invest in your managers and supervisors. Get them trained on how to recognize the signs and symptoms of workplace substance use, and more importantly, what appropriate action steps to take in the heat of the moment there. I believe it's probably the most valuable investment you can make and probably the best tool that you can use to combat workplace substance use.
Absolutely. Your training for your supervisors is critical.
There's also some instances where employers must continue to test for marijuana to comply with federal DOT, Department of Transportation regulations. You may be operating off a federal contract or a grant that dictates the requirement to continue screening for cannabis, or maybe a collective bargaining agreement, or for those companies following voluntary drug-free workplace laws. So again, the big thing here is please understand the laws that apply to your program in each of the states and municipalities that you conduct business in, because they do vary dramatically. Also, job descriptions are holding a whole ton more weight than they did before. While it seemed like a rudimentary HR function to create a job description, for those employers that are out there with safety sensitive workers that are wanting to leverage these safety sensitive carve outs in cannabis laws, you must have written, up to date, comprehensive job descriptions that detail each of the roles within your company. If you go It's not a matter of if, but when your company's ever challenged in the court of law for discriminating against somebody or taking adverse action against somebody, you're going to need to defend yourself. That job position was safety sensitive, and describing the essential functions of that job. You can't just say that all my employees are warehouse employees, so we're all safety sensitive. It's not going to work. It's not the environment, like you said, Bill. It's the specific
Yeah.
job.
State Supreme Courts in Minnesota, Iowa recently decided that it's not the environment that determines safety sensitivity, it is the job itself.
That's right. All right, I'm going to spend a moment here, a couple slides on the benefits of oral fluid testing. Again, we believe that, and I think our friends at Quest, or actually it was our friends at the Department of Transportation, also believe that there's going to be a pretty big shift from the utilization of urine drug testing over to oral fluid testing because of the benefits and advantages of oral fluid testing. Most significantly, it has a shorter detection time period for all drugs of abuse, so it's excellent at determining more recent use of most prohibited substances. It's incredibly easy, quick, and far less an intrusive of a collection process. We're not dealing with urine here, so I think that's pretty obvious. Another unique benefit is that oral fluid collections are always done as a directly observed collection, so eliminating the ability to substitute or adulterate a drug test. We talked about how there was a 600+% increase in drug test cheating for urine drug testing. That concern is almost virtually eliminated with oral fluid collections because they're directly observed collections. We also, Bill stressed on the fact that oral fluid testing is one of the only methodologies you can use to determine Delta 9 THC, specifically for cannabis testing. So again, in my opinion, the only tool that employers should be using in states like California and Washington, at least Washington pre-hire, to take adverse action based on a test, because that methodology does show Delta 9 THC. There's a couple of quick notes here from a legal perspective that you also should be aware that some state laws specifically define specimen, what specimens you can use to conduct workplace drug testing. There are also some states that limit or prohibit the use of instant, rapid, or point of care drug tests. They may require lab-based testing. And then there's also some states that may dictate the cutoff levels you're using. So again, it's incredibly important to know exactly what the laws are in each of the states and cities that you're operating in.
I would make one other point, and that is in those states that have specific language about not discriminating against off-duty use, there's a handful of them, but there's also those 28 states that say you can only take action if you find them to be using at work. Boy, I would certainly encourage using oral fluid testing in those states.
We know that you can't determine if someone's under the influence at work. There's no methodology available. So now the only tool that you have is determining more recent use, and oral fluid provides that. Yeah. Another quick note that oral fluid testing as a alternative specimen method was approved at the federal level for Department of Transportation drug testing. Obviously, that's on hold till they figure out the logistics of getting the labs ready and the devices ready. But it was important for me to include this slide because at a federal level, the science of oral fluid testing has been vouched for to support drug testing and its applicability, and it's compared to that of the accuracy of urine. So again, the fact that it's vouched at a federal level holds some incredible weight as far as defensibility on employment adverse actions. So we want to wrap the conversation with some guidance. We always like to include here that the OSHA General Duty Clause, which overarches every employer out there, requiring them to have a workplace that is free of recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to its employees. I think we can all agree that cannabis is an impairing substance and certainly would fall into this category if it was in the workplace environments. But really, to limit your liability as an employer, we strongly suggest, if you don't have it already, make sure you create, implement, and have a routinely review your drug-free workplace policy. That should reflect all the state laws, case law, etc., consequences that'll be imposed for those that violate the policy. Make sure you constantly review that for any legal updates, what methodologies you should be using, and stay up to date as these rules change incredibly often. Make sure you've designed and implemented sound processes and procedures that complement the language of your company policy. Give your managers and supervisors standard operating procedures to enforce the goals of your policy so they know what steps to take in the heat of the moment. We talked about looking at the different methodologies and products that are out there today for workplace drug testing. And it may be one of those things where you decide to use one methodology for your pre-hire testing and use a different methodology post-hire, again, depending on the situations, depending on the limitations at the state levels, etc. I will harp one last time to please provide your managers and supervisors with training. Let them know exactly the details of your substance abuse policy, the procedures you expect of them. Please train them to recognize the signs and symptoms of workplace drug and alcohol use, and most importantly, what appropriate action steps they should take in the heat of the moment of those situations. A far more valuable tool than employers realize today. Make sure that you have documented and you routinely review your comprehensive job descriptions for each of the roles within your company, especially critical for those roles that you're going to be considering safety sensitive. Make sure you're describing the essential functions of those jobs in detail so that you're prepared to defend yourself in the court of law when you're ever challenged. And also from the medical marijuana side, make sure you're prepared to engage in that interactive conversation with a medical marijuana patient to see if you can reasonably accommodate their underlying medical conditions in your workplace or not prior to taking any adverse employment actions. Now, I know we rushed through a lot of that stuff. There was far more things we probably could have talked about. This is our famous wheel of compliance that we have. That marijuana issues, state compliance issues are just a few of the things that employers need to face. We really didn't get a chance to talk about work comp issues, ADA drug and alcohol testing issues, some different court and agency decisions and unemployment decisions. But again, this is a lot for employers to stay focused on, stuff that we focus on from a regulatory and research level every single day and try to help employers navigate. All right. So Antique, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We're going to open it up for questions. I saw a lot of them come through here. So I don't know if you want to tee them up or if you want me to go through them.
Sure, I could go through them. So one is our local clinic does not offer saliva testing. Can we do our own on-site testing for pre-employment and post-accident?
That's a great question. And as we know, a lot of the big laboratory providers out there with their own service centers are slowly starting to adopt oral fluid testing, slowly starting to provide or get devices in and inventory in because they understand that this is the trend where this is going, especially for our friends in Washington here and California that are already limited to utilizing only oral fluids. So the answer to your question is yes, you as an employer can conduct your own workplace drug tests so long as it doesn't violate state law.
Yeah. And make sure that those folks that are administering it for your company are somewhat trained or trained the best you can. A lot of the manufacturers of the devices will have, YouTube videos where you can go on and take a look, or you can basically read the package and that gives you the instructions how to do it. But it's simpler to use than certainly urine testing.
I agree.
Is there a way to test for marijuana that could show when THC was last used?
I've read a couple of studies that have attempted to do that. The bottom line is that it's still an open question. The closest we've seen are the Buzzkill data, which shows that somebody used within the last 3.5 to 4 hours.
And I think that's the tightest that we've gotten so far. There are some studies out there utilizing different methodologies and such like that. But from a practical perspective for employers, that 3-hour window is the tightest that we've seen for oral fluid testing using chromatography technology, not just the reagent test strips. But and who knows how this will evolve from a scientific and solution perspective over the next few years here.
Yeah, and you got to be careful on those studies that you read because one of the studies I read used carboxy THC, which is useless.
Can we ask job applicants or employees if they use medical or legal marijuana?
The smartest thing to do with respect to medical marijuana is not just ask applicants as they apply, are you a medical marijuana patient? If there's a positive test that comes up for marijuana, then you can get into it. then you can ask and you can have them provide proof that they are in fact an authorized medical marijuana patient. But I wouldn't just at this stage, I would not generally go out there asking folks if they're a medical marijuana patient.
Our company operates in multiple states and has remote employees. Can we have a policy that applies to everyone?
You can have a general policy. We refer to it as the core company policy, but then you're going to need to have state-specific addenda because there are so many states that have their own slant on things, their own rules. And you got to have those you got to take those into account. There's no doubt about it.
I would elaborate to say long gone are the days for having a nationwide
Yes.
zero tolerance drug testing policy. It's
Can't
just
do
too
it.
complicated with the rules, the regulations, the case law that's out there right now. It really changes by state or differs by state and even by city or
Yeah.
municipality. So especially for those employers that operate in multiple states and have remote employees, it's incredibly critical to understand the state laws that apply and that you consider those in your policy. As Bill mentioned, you can have the kitchen sink, the core company policy, but you certainly can't apply those rules broadly. A policy here in Washington, a core policy would apply completely different than it would in Texas or than it would in Illinois where Bill's sitting. It just is tough and needs to be addressed by state.
That's exactly right. You can, and please do not use your federal policy, your DOT policy for non-regulated workers.
There was another question in here while we're teeing up the next one. Medical marijuana would not be allowed for FTA, Federal Transit Authority or Administration, safety sensitive drivers, correct? And that is absolutely correct. Again, everything we're talking about today was at the state level. If you have employees that must follow DOT regulations, there is zero exceptions for the personal adult use or the medical use of cannabis or even CBD products. In fact, the DOT actually has on their website a notice that they issued several years ago on all three topics, saying that someone cannot use the legal adult use of marijuana, their medical status, or the fact that they use CBD to overturn a federal drug test for cannabis.
Yeah.
But again, as Bill just mentioned, you can't apply a federal testing program to individuals that are not federally regulated or performing regulated safety sensitive positions. So be careful that you discern the rules by the regulating authority, whether they're regulated or not.
One more point on that. Be careful. We often hear from employers that we are a federally regulated company, therefore we're not going to accept marijuana. Be careful of that. Those rules only apply to those individuals who are in fact performing federally sanctioned job functions or federal contractors, those who are specifically acting under the federal contract. They don't apply to non-regulated, non-contracted workers. Be careful.
What about new impairment technologies that we see being marketed to determine marijuana use?
Yeah, that's something we've been following as well. And man, is it changing pretty quickly. Again, everybody's in this trying to solve the recent use or the marijuana impairment problem, right? Because it's potentially very fruitful for whoever's going to be the first to market there. And we're aware of products out there like the impairment goggles or the phone apps that are using cognitive tests to determine if someone's under the influence. The only thing I would say is that be very careful that all these apps determine someone's under the influence, but doesn't determine what they are under the influence of. It could be substance use. It could be someone's tired. It could be a medical related issue or a medication related issue. I think that there are products out there that are excellent for employers to adopt to utilize as a tool to better establish reasonable suspicion or signs and symptoms of impairment, but must.
Yep, I think we lost Nick. I think you got what Nick was about to say is that you have to be very cautious and make sure you look at what the courts have said in your state about the use of those kinds of test results as being able to either establish reasonable suspicion or the ultimate conclusion of whether someone's impaired. Courts are very skeptical of being able to show that those test results show the ultimate question of whether you're impaired. But you may be able to use them to establish, as Nick was, I'm sure, about to say, the question of whether there's reasonable suspicion to go to a further test.
Do you have any suggestions for the wording on those drug policy statements?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a loaded question because again, we're going to have to address it by state, right? And by municipality potentially.
Yeah, I would hesitate to provide a general statement on such things because I'd want to see in what context it's being used and as Nick says, the state involved and everything else that's involved in the question before we say yes. But can
Yeah,
it be
but
worked out? You bet. That's Nick and I do that every day.
work with your CISM team or reach out to us. We're happy to address issues or have conversations more specific to your workplace program in the states and municipalities that you operate in.
Yeah, and by the way, if you haven't looked at or reviewed your policy in the last 2 years, you're behind the times. You better get it up to date.
Thank you for joining us today, Bill and Nick. I'd like to thank you for being with us and providing us with such an informative and timely presentation. If you have any questions about our drug testing solutions, you can scan the QR code on your screen right now to contact one of our screening experts. Thanks again for joining us and have a great rest of your day, everyone.